Welcome to Reading Rule, y'all, where we talk about all things rural YA literature and to the rural authors who write it. I'm your host, Dr. Shay Parton, and I'm excited to talk to you about today's topic at hand. If you're a teacher, student, or community member in a rural community, my hope is that the content here honors you and your experiences by discussing and analyzing books that can serve as a mirror for you. If you're an urban or suburban teacher, student, or community member, this series is for you too, and I hope that it can provide nuance to the stereotypical depictions of rural people so often seen in popular media. So come on in, and let's get to it. Welcome back to Reading Rule, y'all. I am your host, Dr. Shay Parton, here with an exciting collection of stories to talk about. And their author, Terena Elizabeth Bell, is joining me today. Welcome to the show. Terena has written more than 100 publications, including pieces in the Atlantic, Playboy, Yale Review, and others. Her short fiction has won grants from the Kentucky Foundation for Women and the New York Foundation for the Arts. Whiskey Tip Books will publish her debut story collection, Tell Me What You See, December 8th, and that is what we are here to talk about today. Welcome, and thank you so much for joining me.
Hi, thank you for having me, and hi to everybody watching at home, or I guess if you're not at home, you could also be watching at work or just watching online.
Or listening via the podcast, because I take the audio and make it into a listening show as well. So
Thank you to everybody out there joining us as well, and thank you, Shay, for having me. I've been
I'm
very excited.
Me too. I'm so glad you're here and I get to talk to you face to face, even if not in person. So the first question is my obsession. It's the question that I ask everyone who comes on the show because I am so curious to know about it. And that is, where are you from and how do you think that's impacted you as both a person and a writer?
Absolutely and completely. It is the essence of who I am and what I do in the world. I'm originally from Sinking Fork, Kentucky. That is in Christian County, which is in the western part of the state. And it's funny, my family has been in that one little section of the world, depending on which branches you go back to, from the 1700s to the 1800s. So that's very much where I'm from. You know, it's not just where I lived when I was little. It's like I said earlier, it's who I am. So it was a very, very, very supportive arts community. I live in New York City now, and I have people a lot, especially when I first moved up here. People would be like, "Well, I bet it's real different from Kentucky," and not like in a derogatory way, but just in a, it really must be a change because you've got millions of people crammed on a little island here, and I was one of 19 in my graduating high school class. So what I tell them is that actually New York and Kentucky are more similar than most people know because of the love of the arts and the presence of the arts and of artists. I've got a cousin that he played at the Grand Ole Opry. Pretty much everybody in my family plays something. I see you've got your guitar back there, Shay. You're not kin to Dolly, are you?
Actually, yes, I am.
Oh, hey! Okay, sorry. I kind of meant that as a joke, but that's way cool. No wonder you're into books. My mother was a dancer. My grandmother on my mom's side was an oil painter. My grandmother on my dad's side, she whittled, which I consider to be a form of sculpture.
Mhm.
And my father himself is an artist also. So you just arted where I lived. And, I know that there are other parts, like especially in the eastern part of the state, um, uh, art is very, very much part of the culture. And there are some places in Kentucky where it's not as much, but Kentucky writers are something that I just grew up around my whole life. You grow up reading Jesse Stewart. Bell Hooks is from the same
Yeah.
town that I'm from, or at least the county seat.
Right.
And I've been exposed. I wrote my first short story when I was 5, and just got encouraged from there. Like it wasn't like art was something that some people did or that you stumbled into. It was just once you were born, you were going to art somehow. That's just how
Mhm.
my community was. Like went to art guild meetings with my grandmother and painting workshops when I was a kid, just that kind of thing. So,
Yeah, that's awesome. And it reminds me of my conversation with Jenny Meyer saying she talked about how in small towns, when you're an artist, like there's so many more opportunities to art than sometimes in bigger places because there's not as many people vying for, the stage or, the exhibition hall or, whatever it is. Like
yeah.
there's there's more opportunities for students of art and people who are working on becoming, growing in their art, to sort of show out and show what they can do, and people who appreciate that. My dad actually has a music school and studio in the small town in Tipton, Indiana, where he grew up. And he has tons of students who come and they do shows around town. They play the pork festival. They play, like all of these. They have like community concerts at the Moose Lodge and stuff, where folks turn up in droves to watch these kids work on their art. And I think that's amazing. And I think that that's something that not a lot of people think about when they think about small towns.
Yeah.
Um,
And it's funny, like I'm doing a sort of mini book tour in late December, but all of the places are in Kentucky. And it's funny because my mom kept saying, she's like, well, honey, you need to go to bookstores in New York. And I was like, well, yeah, because I mean, theoretically, like I would sell more books, but they're not going to take you because they're getting requests from writers all around the world, like not even
mhm,
just local. And, I love, like, New York is a very thriving art scene, but when it came down to me learning as an individual, I was much better nourished in Kentucky. Like when I go home, I've got 5 different signings in 2 days, and that's insane. And there's not even a bookstore where I grew up. But it's like the library in this county is having me, the library in that county is having me. There's a local art museum in another county that's having me. Like there's a holiday parade where I am not going down and throwing the books like candy. But, I mean, it's just people go to those things. Like the Art Guild in Christian County, the county where I grew up, they are actually having me come and speak about some of the visual art that's in the book.
mm,
And they're selling 40 tickets to it,
mm,
and that just blows my publisher away. But it's because like they know me, and then also it's part of what they have to do.
mhm.
Like that is a society activity to go and hear someone speak like that. Whereas here in the city there's so many options. A lot of them I don't go to because I have to be on the subway an hour each way, or they want to charge you $30, and over time that adds up. So I completely agree with you that the arts are very much more accessible in a small town, which sounds weird because we have more resources when you go to list them. But yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that, a lot of the work that I do is trying to sort of like get people to re-see, or which kind of actually connects to your collection, but get to reimagine or re-see or understand in a new way the sort of flip side that exists to all of these different stereotypes of rural people and rural life.
yeah,
And so like the idea that like rural places don't have culture, or that that they're just sort of like, I don't know, these like black holes where, people are just waving bad flags and doing bad things, as Monica Rowe said in an interview I did with her, which I just has stuck with me. And I absolutely love that description of it. But, like rural places are thrive in a lot of different ways. Like, yes, there are issues, and yes, there are, challenges, but that's the same with every place. And so like to think that there aren't people producing great art
right.
in rural places. I mean, your mention of bell hooks, like, I mean, in my education programs, we always read bell hooks, but not a single person talked about how she was from La Brea, Kentucky. Or wait, where was it? I forget. Is that,
She
no, she's
taught in
from
Berea and lived in
Berea.
Berea, which is in the eastern part of the state, for the vast majority of her life. But she grew up in Hopkinsville, which is in the western part. So
Right, right, right.
I'm
But
even
both
from
were
that
rural.
town, and I thought she was from Berea until, like, I don't know, maybe 10 or 15 years ago. Yes, they're both very, very rural.
Yeah, and so we never talked about that, right? Like, and she gets like taken up as obviously a powerhouse of
Yeah,
critical theory, and thinking about blackness and black
yes.
experience as black womanhood, all of those things, especially in connection to teaching, with like teaching to transgress. But not a single time did we talk about how she wasn't from a city. Anyway, I just, looking back, it just frustrates me because I think that we need to have conversations like that. But anyway, that to say that like obviously rural places produce art, and they produce good art, and they also consume that art. And so they do have culture, and they have culture that is specific to their places. And so I think that that's one of the interesting things about your short story collection too, is the way that like not only like who you are as a placed person. And I don't know if you identify as a rural out migrant or not, but that's what I call myself,
As a rule, what?
out migrant.
Oh, like having immigrate, like immigrate, whichever one's the e, like out of.
Right. Yeah, like you grew up in a rural place and then you left that rural place and you settled in a non-rural place.
Yeah, I've never heard that term before, but if I understand it correctly, technically I would be. I mean, I live in New York City and I'm from
Right.
St. Fort, Kentucky.
Right. Right. So that's how I think of myself. And so there's this like this third space of identity building where you're no longer living in your rural home, but you still identify as a rural person. And
Yeah,
but you're living outside of that. And so like those negotiations of like who you are as a place connected person, not only in the present, but from your past. And so how that affects, like who you think of. And then there's the interactions that you were talking about when we first started, talking. I think I started recording, but I can't remember now. But you were talking about how like, folks in New York would ask you when they heard you speak, like how long you were in town for, basically, like how long are you staying? And you're like, well, actually, I live here. Um, and so there are those little like microaggressions too about how that remind you that you don't actually technically belong where you are according to other people who are there. Um, and so I think all of that definitely comes through in your writing.
thank you.
Um,
It's funny. A lot of people in New York, like when I first moved up here, I lived in Washington D.C. before, and when people would comment on your accent there, they meant it negatively. Like
yeah.
you could tell from their tone that it was pejorative, And I even had one lady, I was at a meeting at the Ronald Reagan Convention Center for, I think it was like an African Business Week or something. And I used to own a translation company. So, but she said, she said, it must be real different for you being in a city. And I just looked at her and I said, yeah, y'all make us wear shoes up here. Because it was just like you could just tell. But it's when I moved to New York and people started asking that, most of them it was just genuine interest, like because
Hmm.
this is a very multicultural city.
Yes.
But the longer I lived here, the more that it kind of got to wear on me because it was like, how long do I need to live here before you count me among you? Because I've been
Yeah.
here 8 years or something. But yeah, it
Yeah.
really helps you understand, what other people go through when they face similar microaggressions and
Yeah. I actually had a guest contributor publish on the blog about how um she hadn't heard the term rural out migrant either.
yeah,
But like that term really helped her start to think about her identity and also the ways that she connects to her displaced students because she teaches in a more urban environment. She has refugee students and she has immigrant students, and thinking about herself as an out migrant has helped her understand like why and how she connects to those students in specific ways. Part of it is because of that, because of the constantly you know not really feeling like you fit where you are, and people asking where you're from in a way that isn't really very nice, and those kind of things. And so and just not knowing like when I moved to Austin, I just didn't know how to be here. Like I didn't know how to exist here. Like I didn't know how to use a busing system. I didn't know where to park, and how to pay for parking when I parked there. The buildings were all so close. It felt so suffocating. And I mean, I had moved to like West Lafayette to attend Purdue University, but that was a far cry from what I experienced in Austin. And like one of my bucket list items was to go to a tape-in of Austin City Limits because I grew up on, watching that. And I
yeah.
got to go, and I got to go for Coulter Wall because I, magically won tickets to that one. But I wasn't going to go unless I could take somebody who would show me where to go, what to do, because it was just like so anxiety inducing. And so, and also just not really knowing how to interact with people, like, and I wrote a blog about this, about my dad asking the guy sitting on the bench if he could be his friend because he needed to sit down because his hip hurt. And the guy looked at him like, and then he said, "What do you mean by that?" And my dad looked like, "Why are you being so mean to me for?" And I was like, sir, he doesn't mean anything by it. His hip hurts. You're taking up this whole bench. He just needs to sit down. Like, can you scoot over so that he can sit down? And afterward, we were walking to the Texas Chili Parlor because of Guy Clark's Dublin Blues. You know, we had to go get a Mad Dog margarita at the Texas Chili Parlor, and Daddy was like, why was he so mean to me? Like, he just was like trying to figure out like what happened in that interaction. I'm like, Dad, we're in a city. We're in a city whose tag phrase is keep Austin weird. If someone comes up to you in Austin and says, "Can I be your friend?" like, like you you need to know what that means before you proceed.
Now, my dad has I think scared young women on the subway. You know, and he is a wonderful person. But the last time that they visited, there was an empty. There weren't a lot of empty seats, but there was one kind of across from me, next to a girl, I guess like in her 20s. And Daddy just reached out and just kind of touched her shoulder, and he was like, "Do you mind if I sit here?" And he was like trying to be polite, but she thought he was hitting on her. And it made the young lady highly uncomfortable. And then so he sits next to her, and then the young lady turns like this to like kind of get away from him. And he reaches out and taps her, and he's like, "Oh no," he's like, "You take all the room you want. I'm so sorry." Like, because he thought she was like trying to get more space. He's like, "Let me scoot over." And she was just like you could just tell from the look on her face that she was like this old man. But it's funny because like while you were talking, I was thinking about how that's in Austin. I was like, but Austin is the South. And then it hit me for years. It took a long time because I traveled when I owned my translation company. I lived in Kentucky, but I traveled internationally. So I've been kind of in and out of Kentucky, gosh, since my mid 20s. And it hit me when I first started having to spend a lot of time because even my college, I went to Center College, which is a liberal arts school in Danville, Kentucky, which was even smaller than my hometown.
Mhm.
And it hit me. It took years for me to realize this, but I had set in my mind that it was a north-south divide.
Mm.
And then I lived in Louisville, Kentucky for a while, and I was like, what is wrong with y'all? Like, this is my state. Like, I'd even have people there asking, where are you from? And I'd be like, the same dang state you are, lady. So just quit your commenting, but it's funny because when I moved to Louisville, that's when I started to kind of figure out it's not a north south thing, it's a rural urban thing. And it was so frustrating to be, again, like in the largest state in my own home state, like it's within the Commonwealth. And they were so different,
Mhm.
and but it is, there is a clear, and it's funny because this is something, because you and I met through Twitter,
Mhm.
and we've tweeted at times about how there is a difference between Southern lit and rural lit.
Mhm.
But it's funny that oftentimes I feel like I have more in common with people who are from out of the South, but from a rural area,
Mhm.
as opposed to someone who grew up in Atlanta or who grew up, not Nashville per se. When I was a kid, Nashville was still, I guess, a reasonably small town as far as they go. But, like someone from Louisville or whatever.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think that that's absolutely true. And in my dissertation study, there was a feller. That's the first word that came to mind. Um, who was from Tuscaloosa, Alabama, or around there, and he was talking about Southern Lit and how like almost all Southern Lit gets conflated as rural lit, even though it's often not.
Right. Or
Um,
Appalachian if you're from Kentucky. Like everybody is like, oh, you're at, and I'm like, no. I'm like, I live like 7 hours from Appalachia.
yeah. 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 And also like there are urban Appalachians, like
Right.
Appalachia is only like, I mean, aside from like the mountain range, but like
Knoxville is
itself, but like the populated areas, like only like 40% of Appalachia is rural. And so like not all Appalachian lit is rural lit, but it gets taken up that way because it's othered, right? Because Appalachians have sort of been treated as like a curiosity of people, and have strong cultural linguistic practices.
very much so.
And so yeah, so I think our ideas of, and there's some really interesting like maps too that people have asked people to draw. I've seen some scholarship where folks have asked like, draw a map, like on this map, tell me where Appalachia is, or whatever. But there's actually a really interesting study that I read somewhat recently about people from Louisville, and their opinions and assumptions about people from Appalachia and the way that they
Hey, hey,
speak
hey.
and things like that. And so yeah, so like even if you're from a state, that doesn't mean that you're rural necessarily, or
Like
that you fit
how much?
into one of those
Sorry.
groups.
I was just going to say, like, how much does your average person in New York City know about anything upstate?
Right.
I
Right.
mean,
Yeah, I have a friend who's from Western New York, and she definitely grew up rural. And she was like my lifesaver in this program down here because everybody else was from urban places. Like, I had a friend who was from Philadelphia, and I had a friend from Seattle. And I remember talking to both of them about how just uncomfortable I was in Austin because I just didn't know how to navigate things and I didn't know how to exist there. And my friend was from Seattle was like, I know this city is so quiet. And I was like, that is not what I mean. That is not what I'm talking about. And I was like, how in the world? She was like, I had to like put on sound machines at night and stuff because this city, I was like nervous walking at night because this city is so quiet. And I was just like,
it's funny. Do you read S.A. Cosby?
yes,
Cosby writes under S.A. It's funny. I'm trying to remember when he said this. I don't know if he said it like a presentation or what, but he was talking about how like you look at like he writes noir and crime, and you look at how like originally like noir and crime like it was all like Chicago stuff like Dick Tracy, like L.A. or whatever, and he was just saying he's from rural Virginia, and
yeah,
he was just saying, look, I'm sorry y'all, but there is nothing more frightening than like having to walk down a road where there's no people and it's pitch dark, and every time you hear anything break, you're like, is it the wind or a person coming to kill me? You know, like it's a very like I suppose if you're not used to growing up with the silence, but it's funny going back to that rural urban divide. I've actually got one of my stories where you can very much see it, where like the
yes,
everything coming from Kentucky is on the right hand side of the page, and everything coming from New York is on the left hand side of the page. And it's about the difference between how the pandemic was in the two different places. And then you've got this main character who, like me, grew up in Kentucky and then moved to New York and was in the city during the pandemic. And everything that she says, it's this column that is split right down the middle.
hmm
And I think
yes.
there's a
And
lot
that
of us
was
that like that line.
brilliant.
And
Absolutely brilliant. So I want to talk about these stories. So let's go ahead. I feel like this is the perfect segue. Um, So one of the things that I was curious about, because I've been reading a lot of short story collections, which is something that I didn't used to do. It was mostly I just read novels, but I think there are more short story collections that are not necessarily available, but are known to me, that are sort of getting maybe more publicity, or with the advent of social media, like it's just becoming so. Like I read Nora Shalloway Carpenter's Rural Voices, which S.A. Cosby has a short story in that. And I've been reading, she has a new collection out with Rocky Callan about, it's called Absolutely Normal, and it's about mental health, stories of living with mental health issues. And I don't like the word issue, but like, what's a good word?
concern.
Yeah, or just
Or
like
just living with mental health,
living
period.
and learning to take care of your mental health, right?
Yeah.
Like, um and so and then your story collection is coming out, and so I just feel like short story collections are more like Rob Costello has a really interesting short story collection that's going to come out, that's he writes rural horror stories, not exclusively, but that's part of a lot of what he does. And um so we've talked about how like the isolation of rural places is really scary to people, and so like rural places are sort of overrepresented in horror fiction than they are in other types of
I
fiction.
actually had a beta reader once in a group, and I feigned to say this because the group itself was amazing and they're very good people. And, like on Tell Me What You See, which
Yeah.
is one of the stories in the collection, they gave me a lot of kind of feedback in a way, but it just, there was one lady in it who, and I was in this group for maybe like a year and a half, all told. And there was one lady in it who every single story that I sent her, she hated it. And she's like, well, I just hate this, and this is horrible, and I don't understand why these people are doing this, and you should explain to the reader what this is. And it would be something like, they went to the Piggly Wiggly, and she's like, well, how am I supposed to know what a Piggly Wiggly is? And it was just like just downright nasty. And then right before I left the group, she actually sent us memoir pages in which she was talking about how afraid she was of rural areas. But she was like, and it was the empty space. And she wrote about this trip that she went to with her husband where there was just nothing but empty space and the land was flat, and just talking about how afraid it made her, like absolutely terrified. I'm like, well, that's it. That's why she hates my stories. She, like, she's afraid of rural people. It's like, how are you afraid of a prairie? Like, like, are the grain going to leap up and attack you? But there are people who, if it's not what they know,
Yes.
they fear
Yes.
it.
Yeah,
They see all these
absolutely.
little pieces of wheat fall,
Yeah. I mean, I guess like agoraphobia, fear of wide open space. Like, I
I,
don't
I
know.
think it's fear of the unknown.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's so
She
true. I
grew up.
mean,
She was born and raised here in New York City, and it's like,
yeah, and that's why, like my mama would always
yeah,
tell me like never to be in a city after a certain time because that's when all the bad stuff happens, right? And I'm sure
nothing
that
good
sounds
happens after
absolutely
midnight.
ridiculous to somebody who actually grew up in a city. And so
Right,
like, yeah, that like just we can only know what's in the realm of our experience. And
right.
so our perspective is absolutely shaped by that. And then when we go into another place that doesn't match our experiences, then of course things are scary because there's uncertainty and again, not knowing how to be there, not knowing how to have a conversation, not knowing that the dude who just needs to sit down isn't hitting on you because
Right.
you have all of these experiences that sort of it's schema, right? Like in educational theory, we have all these experiences that serve as schema that then we build knowledge on top of, but we use it to frame everything else that we learn. And so because of that, because of the way that place absolutely, shapes and influences the schema that we build, that influences how we see every other thing within our experience. And so I guess even though it feels ridiculous, it also makes sense that she might be afraid of open
Well,
spaces.
it's funny, like, because especially because I've lived here for so long, I've been here about 8 years. I've had a lot of fellow writers who are like, "How come you never write anything set in New York?" And it's funny that this collection is what's being published because it's pretty much the only thing that I've ever written that has anything in it about the city. But it's because I don't know New York, and that sounds silly because I've lived here for 8 years. I am a New Yorker. Like, I know this city. I'm a New Yorker. I'm saying with a very thick Kentucky accent. But I was not here as a child.
Mhm.
I was not here as a teenager. Like, my family has not been here since the early 1800s. Kentucky is my schema, and you write what you know. And it's I mean, I guess I could write a story here if I had to, but I don't want to.
Yeah.
This is where I live. This isn't where I exist. If that makes, I don't know. That's
Mm.
coming out
It's
wrong,
kind of
but
like that house home thing, right? Like you can live
yeah.
in a house, but it not may not be your home.
Yeah. In New York, I
Yeah.
mean, I feel at home here, but I just like when you're writing about what motivates somebody or what causes pain in their life or what they wish for or long for, I understand that from my fellow Kentuckians.
Yeah.
I don't know, people who were born and raised here sometimes still feel like a sociological experiment to me, where I'm trying to
Yeah.
figure out why they think that or why they do that. Like they say online here, like go stand online instead of in line.
Inline?
Yeah, and
Yeah.
that's what I'm still trying to figure out. And when it's a place where you're actually from, you either don't question those things or they automatically make sense to you in
Right.
some internal way because of your schema.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. Okay. So thinking about the stories then, when you were writing these stories, like were they already in your mind as that they would be a collection, or were you sort of writing on things simultaneously, but you weren't sure if they would be a collection? Like, I'm curious about that because I know that I couldn't I just don't think that I could ever write a novel. I don't think that I have that type of organizational capacity. But And so like, but I feel like I kind of understand. I've talked to enough writers who do that I sort of understand that process, but I don't know that I understand how people go into thinking about putting a short story collection together, especially when all of the stories are the authors and it's not an edited collection. So could you talk to us a little bit about like how that was for you in putting this collection together?
Yeah, it's funny. A lot of writers, I won't say most, because I think that a lot of times what gets taught, like in MFA programs and other places, as normal is more what they want you to do as opposed to what most people wind up doing. But the current trend, I guess, in writing right now is to kind of sit down, like you were talking about, and think about it as one collection and do like the Olive Kitteridge thing where it's the same characters from the
Mm,
same town in each story,
mm,
or like Holly Goddard Jones has got her initial collection, Girl Trouble, is like that, where it's totally different people, but every single story is set in Russellville, Kentucky. So that's kind of the trend, is to have something to link. And, I really don't know why. To me, you can link something with like an emotion or whatever, or, I'm kind of into like the collective works of John Cheever where you just shove everything in there, and that's just fine with me. But with this one, I did not set out wanting it to be a collection.
mm.
What happened was it was the January 6th attack on the US Capitol.
Right.
And it very, very much upset me. And I know that, we've probably got listeners and watchers who have different opinions on that, but for me personally, I felt completely and utterly helpless. And I have a friend who is a member of Congress,
Mm,
and the part where they were like the people were banging on the doors of the House floor, and they were trying to get in there with guns and stuff. And then, like, inside, they had barred the door and they were trying to keep them from getting in. The camera panned, and I thought I saw her hiding underneath her desk. And it just, and it's crazy because it wasn't her. She was in her office because with Corona, they were only allowing so many in there to vote at a
mm,
time, and it was not her turn.
mm,
Um, but and I guess it's a good thing, that we've got multiple, women in their 30s who are working in Congress now with dark hair, that I could confuse them, but, it's like, I'm not going to complain, but I thought I saw her, and it was just like, that's my friend, so it wasn't just democracy is crumbling. This is horrible. Like, is Dolly Madison going to have to save the flag kind of thing? It was also, my friend is being attacked,
mhm,
and it really, really, really just hit me. And it wasn't just me. Her fiance saw the exact same footage and thought it was her. And
mm,
then when they kind of had all those people flee out of there, my mom called me and she's like, I just saw Haley. So a lot of people thought that it was her, but it wasn't. But it just upset me so much. And, I texted her and I was like, do you need me to come down and like clean your apartment? Like, do you need me to come and like make meals and freeze them? Because I knew she was going to be working a lot. And I was like, what can I do
mm,
to help you get us back on track and to do your job? And she was like, really, like, there's not anything. Just talk to, I am a registered Republican. She was like, just talk to your fellow Republicans, about how this does not represent the party well. This does not represent America well. She was like, that's the most help that you can do, is just talk to people. And I got thinking about it, and I was like, I can write.
mm,
I was like, that's what I can do. And so I got in my mind that I needed to write this story about the invasion. And it just, I couldn't figure out how to do it, because it's not like, you can't do the Freytag plot
mm.
pyramid with this.
Right.
And it's like, oh, this spunky little young congresswoman from Michigan, and she shows up for her first day at work, and then, oh, narrative hook, here come men with tiki torches.
Mm,
Like you just can't do that. And I was like, that's the craziest thing that I've ever seen in my life, Shay. I don't know about you, and I don't ever want
mhm,
to see anything like it again. It was
mhm,
just freaking insane and wrong, on so many, like, it has now been termed by our government as sedition. Like, there is a conviction for seditious conspiracy. So that is a legal, you know what I'm saying? Like, it
yeah,
was sedition.
right.
And if I offend people by saying that, I offend them, but that's legally what it was. And you can't just write about sedition in a normal way.
Mm,
So I knew I had to write about it in a whacked up way because it was whacked up. And for people who haven't seen the collection yet, like, there are original drawings in there, there are photographs, from the day. There's collage where I combine drawings with photographs from that day. So that is kind of very different from the way that most normal stories are read. And then these illustrations are actually used as dialogue.
Mhm.
So, it's like, and then the little girl said, and instead of her saying something, you see the picture.
Mhm.
So that's what I wound up arriving at, but I couldn't come up with that immediately. And I've never really done experimental before.
Mm.
So it's kind of crazy again that this is my debut title is, it's got New York and experimental when I'm just a plain old regular traditional Southern Gothic writer from Kentucky. But uh, what was I even going to say? Oh, so I started kind of playing around with form and I was like, well, how do I learn how to do experimental? So I started looking at like different shapes. Like there's one story that you'd mentioned before the podcast today that has different colors in it to
Mhm.
show like the passage of time and people forgetting things that are happening, and all of that. So I played around with that. There's one story in the book that is the shape of Manhattan
Mm.
and it's in different languages. I took like the US Census results
Mhm.
and translated this same phrase into the languages that the census says is most spoken for that neighborhood of Manhattan.
Mm.
And that's it. Like it looks like one of those home decor posters that people buy at
Mhm.
Pier 1 that have like
Mhm.
the cities with like the word on them and stuff that,
Yes.
kind of hang above their couch. I just started playing around with form. Like I did a choose your own COVID adventure where no matter which choice you made, you died. I just started playing around with form. And so I started amassing, like the choose your own COVID adventure, that story was horrible. It came across as very flip about all of these poor deceased people. So I had to just throw it away. But I started amassing multiple stories at a time while I was building up and trying to figure out how to do this capital story.
Mhm.
And then once I'd done the capital story, I was like, I'm done. And then I went to the Association of Writers Programs conference and I met my publisher, Mia Gillette at Whiskey Tit, and who also grew up in rural and urban areas and has that little bit of a divide.
Mm.
But I met her and I had published a story in their literary magazine. And she said, well, if you ever have anything book length, please, please, please send it. And I thought, I'll bet I've got enough of those to make a collection. So I came
Mm.
home, I had a glass of red wine, and then I just started sticking them in order. And then I emailed it to her. And it's crazy because I've tried to put short story collections together before. And, you go to all of these sessions and seminars and they talk about it in an MFA program. And everybody makes it out to be like this huge science to where it's like, okay, I've got these 10 stories and this is the fourth order I've put them in. And now I'm making note cards where I'm putting the theme in the upper right. And then I'm putting, like if it's rural or urban or whatever down at the bottom. And then I'm going to put like the core emotion in the left. And that will help me. No, I just had a glass of wine and stuck them in order.
I mean, everybody's got a different process,
Right.
Um, yeah, and I think that the way you did it really works. Like there's just I think for me, I felt a through line as I was reading them, but I didn't feel like it was so neat that it was not passe, but like not cliche, but like it didn't give that sort of like too neat and tidy feeling. There was something about it that felt more human than that.
Mm.
And so I really, really love that. And just I mean, I'm just even thinking about some of the stories right now. I'm forgetting the title of it, but the Alzheimer's one,
Oh,
um,
yeah.
that that story, is incredible. And I was just thinking about how it reminds me a little bit of blackout poetry. But it's different than that because it's not like an intentional absence. I mean, it's an intentional absence on your part, but it's not an intentional absence on the character's part.
Right.
And so like as words disappear and the message changes and then that last I'm still here, like, oh my God, Terena.
Mm.
Um it just made me want to cry.
Yeah,
Um
my grandmother and my aunt Tucker both had Alzheimer's, and I've done some genealogical work, and there's even Alzheimer's back, to like 1870s or whatever on that line in my family. But specifically, my grandmother, she was in there. and she couldn't get out sometimes.
Yeah.
But there's not a single day where I do not doubt that she was in there.
Yeah.
And what this story is, to explain to our audience, I just take one memory, and it's from the character's childhood, and it's, I'd say, like a large paragraph maybe.
Yeah.
You
Hmm.
know, but then, and I take the 5 stages of Alzheimer, and for each one, and I looked up like what they lose at what point. You
Yeah.
know, like as far as it affects language and what type of details come out. And I'm not a doctor, but I've always seen Alzheimer as Swiss cheese.
Mm.
You know, to where it's just random holes in places, or almost like a file cabinet where all the files are still in the drawers, but the drawers just start getting locked and you
Hmm.
can't get in them anymore.
Hmm.
You know, but I just take this one memory, and then at the next stage of Alzheimer's, I take the exact same paragraph and I remove words to make it read like it's almost a new whatever. But I don't put things back together. I leave
Right.
the big
Leave the space.
space where that detail has slipped from the person's accessible mind.
Hmm.
And it's just I don't it's almost hard for me to talk about, but it's like I just they are still there.
Hmm.
They're still there,
Hmm.
you know.
That story and the way that you wrote it is so powerful. And I remember having a conversation, and like, this may sound weird, but just go with me, because I swear it connects. In my undergraduate romanticism class at Purdue, we read Gerard Manley Hopkins, who wasn't a romantic poet, but we were sort of situating ourselves like time wise and form, and how that sort of how they linked up. So we read Gerard Manley Hopkins' Spring, and it was the first time in my life where we talked about how form can reflect content, in terms of writing, and what that can be like and what that can look like. And it just like blew my mind. And so when I was reading this story, that memory popped up for me, and I was once again blown away by the way that writers can make form and content reflect each other to be like just some of the most powerful, like emotionally engaging, and um especially for somebody who's an empath. But I just talking about it, I have goosebumps because that story is so good.
Thank you.
um but
It's
I felt the same way about the COVID story that you were talking about earlier with the columns. That too was brilliant. And so one of the things that I thought was really interesting too about this collection is like, when we emailed at first to talk about what we would do in this interview, you sort of mentioned like how you saw where people were from. And I think that that comes across like really clear in the COVID story. But for some of the other stories, there's not an explicit like, and this person was from this place in Kentucky.
Yeah.
And so one of the things that I thought we might talk about and think about together today, is how you were thinking about place as you wrote, and then like whether or not like what what is the effect, what is the point, what is I don't know, like what does it do to mention or not mention where something takes place for an author and a reader, because that's a transaction, like thinking about Rosenblatt's like transactional theory of reading. All of my work focuses on the way that place comes up for us, because I think we're always writing through place, and I think we're always reading through place. And so when place is very important and formative for the writer who's writing the story, but the reader might not be from that place. So like if you're writing a rural story as a rural author and somebody from an urban place reads it, like what do you think are sort of like the benefits and drawbacks of mentioning or not mentioning where something is set in your mind? And I don't know, just like I'm just curious to continue to think about like the effect this has for both the actions of reading and writing, if that makes sense.
I don't know if you're, well, first off, I don't think we should have to mention it. Like if you
Mm,
pick up a story where the character comes out of his apartment building, you know, walks a mile, gets on the subway,
mm,
you know, looks gets off the subway at the train station and looks around with wonderment in his, well, no, wonderment would be somebody not from there, but, looks around with just like hopelessness in his eyes as he tries to figure out, is it even worth taking the train upstate to see her? I don't have to say that's set in New York City.
Right.
And to me, it's like, well, so why do we have to say it?
Mm.
And it's I don't know, like my mom says that sometimes I'm a lone tree, and she says that if you have, how you have a windbreak of just a bunch of maybe like seven trees, like in the
Yep.
middle of a field, like
Yep.
we're tornado,
Yep.
we're not the tornado alley. I think they call us Dixie Alley in Kentucky, but we get our fair share of them.
Yeah.
And you just have it there as like a windbreak, and if you have like that little grove of trees, they will actually kind of break the wind,
Right.
and it can protect your crops on the other side, and that kind of thing, because it kind of slows the wind, at least for that patch of space. But if you only have one tree out in the middle of your field, like in between where you're growing stuff, and the wind comes, that tree will break. And she often says that like I'm a lone tree because I try to like take on all these things by myself. Like well, we shouldn't have to say it. But it's just, I don't know, like part of it is, well, we shouldn't have to. Like, what makes us the ones that have to explain ourselves? But then also, to me, like, if writing is really good, like I don't know anywhere in the Wizard of Oz, I guess we're on a tornado theme, that explicitly says Dorothy was rural.
Yeah.
Like they say she was on a farm. They say she's from Kansas. I've always gotten the impression that they were maybe lower socioeconomic, because it
Yeah.
talks about like her parents haven't been deceased and she's living with her aunt, and she only had the one gingham dress.
Yeah.
But to me, like, we shouldn't have to say it. But I've also missed out on publishing opportunities because, like I was talking earlier, that beta reader who didn't know what a Piggly Wiggly was,
Right.
I've missed out on those because they were too local or they were too southern for our national magazine,
Uh,
or whatever, or people just not like. I did. I hate to say my MFA program. I went to the low residency 2 weeks and then I quit.
okay.
But like there was somebody in that I was writing a line, and this is something that's funny, at least in the South, because we're Bible Belt. Christianity is a big part of the rural Southern culture,
Hmm.
and in a Protestant Bible, you don't find it in a Catholic Bible, but in a Protestant Bible, the words that Jesus speaks are in red.
Red.
And that's something that, just even if you're not a Christian and you're in the rural South, you just know that because like you've seen a Bible or you've heard people talk about it or whatever. And I had a line where I said that the boy thought so much of himself he spoke in red. And this person got highly upset at me, and he's like, well, it's like you want everybody to be a Christian. And I'm like, no, this is just what that character would say. And the character's not going to sit there. And he's like, well, you should explain what it is. And I'm like, but that's bad writing.
Yeah.
That would be bad writing for he's so full of himself, the boy speaks in red. And just to remind you, the red are the words of Jesus. Like that's bad writing, so on some level. But I was reminded, though, that we do have a responsibility to not make readers come to us all the time if they
Mm.
are unfamiliar with our background or
Mhm.
the story's background, character's background. I don't know if you're familiar with Elif, and I'm probably going to mispronounce her last name, but Elif Shafak. She's a Booker Prize winner Turkish novelist.
Yes, and she talks about the circles,
Yeah,
right?
yeah. So you've heard this.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny, I had not, she spoke at a business conference that I went to, during COVID or whatever, like online virtual.
Yeah.
And she is a very, very place-centered writer. Like
Yes.
most of her stuff is set in Istanbul,
Yeah.
and you've already heard this, but just explaining for audience members who may not have. But it's very, very location centric. And you could take that, even put it in another Turkish town, and it wouldn't work. And I asked her at the event, I was like, how do you handle it when, people who aren't from Istanbul don't know what you're talking about? And that balance between having to explain, like things in your writing that, like I never, before that man said it, I never would have thought, because at that age, I just kind of assumed everybody had seen a Bible. It's like, even if you're not Christian, like surely you've seen one. It's the top selling book in the world, But I was not even aware at that time that the Catholic Bible does not show the words of Christ in red. So that was part of my not understanding the reader's schema.
Mm.
But something that that the Turkish lady, that Elif says, is that basically you're a circle and you're drawing a compass when you write, and that you put the center of the compass in the center of your story's place. And then you draw out a line around it and you write for within that circle. And that it is your job as a writer to make sure that you do draw the circle. That way people can be brought in and you are welcoming them into the world of your story, as opposed to excluding them because they haven't seen a Bible, or
Mhm.
whatever.
Mhm.
But also there is a responsibility of the reader, because there's only so big that you can extend a compass to. And
Mhm.
there's a responsibility of the reader to be willing to come into that circle.
Mhm.
And so when I kind of, I don't know, jocundly say, why do we have to be the ones to say, you know, I don't know, like sometimes I think that the reader forgets their responsibility to come into the circle. And
Mhm.
maybe that's me not wanting to draw my circle big enough. That's very possible. And me stubbornly being the one little lone tree and going, well, this is how far my branches go. And if the wind doesn't like it, because that's kind of my personality, period.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Yeah, I've had similar experiences, not a lot of it was with academic writing, but like questions about like one of my participants is from rural South Carolina and she identifies as Gullah Geechee. And I don't define that because I can't, because I'm not Gullah Geechee, and so I sort of explain a little bit in some of the other analysis, like what that is. But I had one reviewer of an article that I sent to a journal say, like, what is this? And I'm like, it's
What
not
type
my
of
job to
dialect?
explain it to you.
I mean, I don't know. I mean, I owned a translation company, so I have a lot of linguistics and language background, but that is such a beautiful dialect. And then the
Yeah.
whole culture goes with it. And like to me, like I don't know if I were, what type of subject was was it,
So it was
sorry.
it was an article sort of detailing how my participants built their rural outmigrant identities and thought about themselves as
You shouldn't
rural
have
or
to
non-rural.
explain. Like if you had
Um,
in there like that it was a Muslim student, you should not have to explain Islam. Like you should not
yeah,
have to explain a student's
it's
culture.
easy enough to Google anyways. But like I just was like, I shouldn't have to explain that to you. But I tend to have that kind of attitude myself. Um, like this is it's a team effort, you know,
Yeah.
to create meaning from reading and writing, and so I just feel like they're and I just get frustrated sometimes that the world is so metrocentric and urban normative, and I get tired of having to explain things.
Yeah.
Or I get tired. I think I told somebody once that something was worthless as tits on a board, um, because that's just what we say at my house if something's worthless. And we raised hogs for a while, and I just feel like if you come from an agrarian rural environment, like you're gonna know what that means. And sometimes I just forget that like people don't know what that means.
Mine is set
Um,
a store by. Like if you really esteem someone, like he sets a store. It's like, well,
yeah,
daddy, he sets a store by you, and then or the fixing to. Like I've actually kind of
fixing to.
gotten rid of fixing to from my vocabulary, which looking back at, I'm really kind of sad. I guess I just
Yeah.
modulated over time, but I still say set a store by a lot. And people, they're like they envision like this literal physical store, and I'm like, what? And they're like, wait, like your dad will go in a store, and I've even tried looking for like where it comes from, but it just
Yeah.
means that you really like and admire, or I guess esteem is the closest. You just really esteem, like you said, a store by 'em.
Yeah.
But I did find something sometime, but it had something to do with like trust, that you would set your stores, like your supply of
Yeah.
food or whatever, that you would set your stores by them and leave them with it.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, I don't know, like I've had this conversation too about like dialect, about language variety, and how authors choose to include or not include the way that their characters would sound. And I've
Mhm.
had a lot of different responses, but almost every single response sort of sits in deference to readers who have grown up not speaking rural language varieties. And so I grapple with that a lot, because it's like, well, but but like the people we are writing, the people who would see this as a mirror, like, also need to see and hear their own rural language variety so they don't get rid of fix into. I still say fix into. I still use the prefix well, I'm going to the store, you know.
Well, and that may be why this collection is, I say it like it's set in New York with a Kentucky schema or Kentucky characters, but that may be part of why I did it because, like, I was up here, like, I live by myself, I'm single, so
Mm,
I was up here, like, literally in my, because they were telling us not to go outside when
right.
all of this started.
Yeah.
Some people were even told not to open windows.
Yeah.
And so I was literally by myself day in, day out, in my apartment. And I forget sometimes, like you were talking about reckon, like I used to say reckon all the time. I forget that I used to say reckon. Like when I was younger, I used to say do what?
Yeah. I still
Like
say that.
what? Like,
Do
and
what?
I eradicated that from my vocabulary in my early 20s because I was working for NBC and everybody made fun of me.
Ah,
But it just like they even had a guy draw this caricature and put it on the wall when I came into work of like me going with like a bubble going, do what? Like they really, so I just got rid of it. But it's funny because I worry sometimes when I'm writing dialogue with characters back home, it's like I don't want things to come across as too country.
yeah,
Like,
as a
I've got a
caricature.
biblical, yeah, I've got a biblical retailing of Esther in this
Yeah.
that I have both my parents read, because you don't want to come across as like too country and then build negative stereotypes that
Yeah.
you and I and all these other people out there in the world trying to negate.
Right.
But at the same time, I don't want to take part. Like I do want a character to say reckon, or
Yeah.
whatever. Like I don't want to take part in getting rid of those phrases when I believe greatly that as an artist, part of my job is to put down what I see. But it's just I don't know. I wind up writing a whole lot more like when I go home for Christmas
Yeah.
because I'm back around it and it's
Yeah.
fresh,
Yeah.
and that kind of thing. And then I have this big burst when I come back up where it's accurate. But I have my mom read a lot of my stuff, and that's embarrassing. It's like rural Kentucky is my native language.
Mhm.
That's where I'm from. I lived there until I didn't move away until I was in my early 30s.
Yeah.
We lose at least I don't know. At least I'm kind of a chameleon linguistically. So
Um, yeah, so I totally identify with all of that because I think that there are certain things that I have also worked really hard to get rid of in my speech because for me, I was in like a 6th grade honors class. I was like a latecomer to the GT program and I wanted to show everybody that like I could hang, like that this was where I belonged. And we were reading The Forgotten Door and I loved that book and I had stuff I wanted to say about it. And I said something and I don't know if I think it was a double negative, and or something like ain't got or, something
um,
like that. And my teacher corrected me in front of all of the rest of the students. And then didn't engage with my thinking. Like she corrected my language and then moved on to the next thought. So like that taught me that the way I said something was going to affect how people engaged with the ideas that were coming through the way that I was talking. And so I needed to make sure that I was talking in a way that they were going to pay attention to me, which then made me like this hyper police of my own language and also my parents and grandparents' language. And I would correct my papa all the time, and just didn't have time for that. He did not give he did not give a flying fart, as he would say, um, about my highfalutin, language knowledge. He did not care.
it's funny when I first started a translation company, I had a lot of people ask how I got into translation, and I was like, "Honey, I've been translating my whole life between my home and town."
Yeah.
And it's
Yeah.
like because we went to like our little local community like out in the county for elementary, but starting middle school we got bused to town and town
Um,
kids. And I say this in Hopkinsville, Kentucky, which is the seat. It only has I think like 20,000 some odd people that live
yeah.
there, but the town kids were different. They
Yes.
just
Yeah. And I saw that where I taught, the town that like was technically where the little rural school where I taught was, and the
were.
teeny tiny little town that was, slightly bigger. Yeah, the kids were different. They had different experiences. They had
Yeah.
different ways of knowing and being. And I
They
think,
went on vacation.
yeah,
We didn't go on vacation.
we didn't either. And if we did, we were going to visit family and
Right.
we always drove. I didn't fly on an airplane until I was a freshman in college. And but I think all of this, right? Like all of this shows how important places to the way that we learn to be, the way that we learn to know ourselves, the way that we learn to know others, and to think about experiences outside of ourselves. And you're I think that this collection allows for, because you don't explicitly say, but like that story of Esther, I knew exactly what it was. I knew exactly what it was when I started reading it because I went to Sunday school and, I went to church when I was little. And then there's another one that has a title that is a biblical allusion. Um,
Oh, I go to prepare a place for you.
yes.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's
that is the
the
cancer
cancer
one.
one.
Right.
Yeah,
Yes, I go to
yeah,
prepare a place for you.
yeah.
And
And
I
I
was
wonder
like,
how people would catch that.
I recognize that, And so so all of those things, right? The way that I'm making meaning from these stories is connected to the sort of
Yeah.
meaning that you're making of these sort of, situations. Um and so I really loved the collection. I loved all the stories. I do have one last question and then I probably need to go because I can hear some things happening downstairs. But so my I would definitely use stories from this collection in a secondary setting. I think that students would love them, especially the experimental nature of them, because young folks love anything that feels subversive,
Right.
anything that feels like countercultural. I mean, for the entire history of humanity, that has been true. They like things that are new and exciting, and so I think that they would love this collection. But one of the things that my work centers around is young adult literature, what this is decidedly not. However, thinking about that tell me what you see story, the last one, the one about the insurrection that you've been talking about, um, it prominently features a child character at the, optometrist or ophthalmologist or whatever. And it's the only young person, to my recollection, in the whole collection. Is that right? Yeah.
Yeah.
And so since this podcast, since this series is really geared toward teachers of young folks, I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about like what your vision would be for young people as an audience for your work and especially for this collection.
Well, I don't know. Now, YA, like as a concept, like a lot of the books that we typically think of as YA, with like the very decorative colors and in like the 100, or whatever. That is very, very much a genre. But to me, there's a difference between the YA genre and whether something is suitable for a teenager to read. It shows that there's a difference between what we typically think of as like the Fleischman Kincaid reading level for something,
Yeah.
and whether the content is understood.
Right.
So I'm going to tell you the same thing I told my aunt, 10th grade and up. Told my aunt, there's nothing in here that's more graphic than what we saw on the news.
Mhm. Right. Right. Well, and what's interesting too is like as I read that story, um, and the idea of like what's visible to us, what's comprehensible to us, what we see that we can make meaning of, and like how people and news organizations and parents and right all of these people in our lives, like how they shape and inform and skew
Yeah.
um what we see and how we see it is a huge theme of that story. And so in my mind, that's definitely one of the ones that I would have used in my class for that reason. And I think the speculative stories are really interesting, and I think that those would be I don't think that there is a story in the collection that I wouldn't offer. And I taught 10th grade and up, and I even freshmen I think would, if you created a classroom community where folks were ready to be learners and to dig into critical concepts and support each other as learners, I think that you can pretty much present almost anything,
Yeah.
and
So
have critical conversations about it. So
teachers know their classroom best. We underestimate youth and children.
yes, all the time, all the time. And so I just think like again, um, the meaning that is made in the conversation between writer and reader is unique every time somebody reads something. And there's not a thing in my life that I regret reading because I always got something out of it. And so I think that if we teach children to think critically and to read critically and to always be monitoring, like,
Yeah.
what are you getting from this? Like, what meaning are you making from this? And it doesn't have to be the meaning that scholars say that people should get out of it, because that's not the point of reading.
It
That's
doesn't even
not
have to be the meaning that I, as the author, wanted people to get out
right.
of it.
Exactly.
It doesn't have to be.
Exactly. And so that's what it's about. It's about thinking. It's about making meaning. It's about learning how to hear other people's stories, and to think about human experience, and to think about how the human experience in the story that you read connects to your life then and maybe later as you reflect on the book, or the movie, or the whatever, and I think that I just grew up that way and thinking that way because my dad was a professional musician and we just listened to singer-songwriters all the time, and that's what we did. We heard a song and
Yeah.
we worked to think about together, like, what it meant to us and how it connected to our lives. And so I've just applied that schema across everything: film, TV. I'm constantly thinking about that kind of stuff. I can't
And
turn it off.
that's the most rural thing that there is to
Yeah.
think for yourself. And we've kind of gotten away from that the last few years, to where, like at least the way television paints rural America, there has been like some mob thinking or whatever, like when it comes to politics. But Kentucky's constitution has that every Kentuckian has the right to an opinion. And it's, to me, like the most rural thing there is to think for yourself. And maybe it's all the space that we have, or maybe
Mm.
not being crammed up on everybody. You don't think exactly what they do, but that's, I don't know, like, I feel like almost everybody in my life taught me to think critically from birth.
Yeah.
You know, like,
And that doesn't mean you're always right. It just means that
right,
you're always trying to figure out what's right.
right. The
Yeah.
next,
But
like,
I really appreciate the work that you're doing. I very honestly, I loved this collection. I'm gonna read it again. Um, the experimentation is absolutely genius, and I'm sort of jealous that I didn't think of it.
well, I'm sure you've thought of many other things, like literacy in place as a program at the whole, that I've been in rural literary spaces my whole life and never would have thought to centralize everything the way that you have, is sort of like teaching modules that are very helpful. So,
Well, thank you. I hope they're helpful to folks. It's a very niche market, and so I don't know. I never know if it's really successful or not. It's like,
yeah,
how do you define what that is?
yeah.
But I'm hoping that it's helpful for folks. It's a lot of fun for me, and it's helpful for me. I continue to think about my rural identity and how it makes its way into my teaching practices and the way that we need to be talking to future teachers about it, whether they're going to end up in rural spaces or not. I think a lot about how urban lit makes it into rural spaces, but rural lit doesn't make it into urban spaces. And what those kind of, urban rural coalition building, like what that could do to start to break down stereotypes and to foster greater understanding, and how we can do that through how we can start at least to do that through literature. So I'm just thrilled that people are finding it, and I'm always hoping that people find it helpful. So,
Yeah.
but thank you so much for being here. This has been a delightful conversation, and I hope that it's one of many more. And I'm looking forward to future projects from you. And I hope that you will stay in touch. And I'm just really grateful for your time.
I'm grateful for you, Shay. Thank you very much, and thank you for everybody for listening or watching. So.
Well, I hope you all enjoyed this week's episode. If you like what you heard and want to support the show and keep it a viable endeavor for me, it'd be great if you would like and comment on the YouTube episode. You could talk about what you liked most or what you walked away with. It'd also help if you'd subscribe to the channel. You can also head over to the Support Us page on the Literacy in Place website. There you can learn about all the different ways you can support this work. Like, you can like and follow the website itself, find out where to engage with us via social media, and go leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. Or you could shop our storefront on bookshop.org to get the book featured in this episode or any other books that catch your eye. You could also buy us a coffee at coffee.com and donate once or set up a recurring donation. All of this would be immensely helpful in keeping this show going. So thanks a bunch for doing what you can. Well, that's it for this episode. Until next time, y'all come back now, would ya?